Thank you all for coming today. I'm not far removed from the college experience, and I went to school at the University of Vermont, so the weather was very similar to how it is here, and I know that it was very difficult to leave my dorm room on a day like this, especially if I knew I didn't have a regular class, so thank you all for attending. As Catherine said, my name is Christian Carmody. I'm a PhD candidate here, and I am studying the behaviors and habits of learners. I'm really interested in knowing what are the characteristics that we all bring to acquiring knowledge in the world. Prior to that, I worked at a few tech companies. I had started my own company that I worked for a little while. Eventually, I taught high school for a few years, and now I'm here at UNH. So for the last 10 years, I would say, I've been predominantly focused on the question about the purpose of education. Now, that's a really broad question. What does it mean to be educated? What should students be learning about? And if we narrow our focus to the position you are all in, the question that's been driving me is, what should college students today be learning about, especially given all that you're experiencing in the world? In some ways, you're not dissimilar from other generations. Other generations like yourselves have had to go to school during times of civil unrest, geopolitical tensions, economic volatility. There's also been technological disruptions. However, I don't think the technological disruptions of the past necessarily hold a candle to what you're all experiencing with artificial intelligence. And it's not just students, it's faculty, it's everyday professionals, everyday people trying to figure out what exactly we're dealing with artificial intelligence. So I don't know about you, but I find that everyday conversations are about artificial intelligence. And the phrase that I keep hearing from students like yourselves, as well as faculty members and colleagues, is there's this unsettling feeling of uncertainty. Uncertainty it's an interesting word because what exactly are we uncertain about? I think there's a lot for us to be uncertain about. Over the last couple weeks in particular, there have been major advancements in artificial intelligence that are truly shaking the ground beneath us. How many of you have ever heard of the Zero Human Company? Probably not many people. This is a story I came across a couple days ago. So the Zero Human Company was started by a man named Brian Rommel. He's an AI researcher. He's been researching artificial intelligence for 40 years. And he has created a company that has no human influence whatsoever. It's all run by AI agents. Now, the idea of AI agents is becoming mainstream. In his company, he has Grok AI acting as the CEO. He has Claude acting as the chief engineer officer. And he has Google Gemini working as, like an entry-level worker, if you will. But what's really fascinating about his company is that these AIs are implementing strategy, engineering decisions without his input, and they're paying each other. That was a wild discovery, in my opinion. The fact that these AI agents are not only doing this on their own and they're self-improving, but they are also capable of incentivizing one another through a physics-based currency system that is not the point of this lecture, but it really does bring into question our purpose. And I know that a lot of professionals, including myself, are thinking, what does this mean for our role? And now many of you may be sitting here thinking, well, this all has to do with computers. What about for occupations that have nothing to do with computers, maybe blue-collar work, or for many of you, if maybe you're aspiring to be an occupational therapist or an athletic trainer. A couple weeks ago, Boston Dynamics, which is a robotics company just down in Boston, it's 45 minutes down the road, uploaded this video on YouTube, which we'll just take a quick look at. That video for a couple reasons. One, I watched the video of that robot a couple months ago, and it was stumbling all over the factory. And now it's doing that. And it's using the same LLM systems that we all use on our computers. So now you're taking the digital world and mapping it onto the physical world, and you have a robot that is self-improving. It's self-learning at this point. So right now, you're all sitting here as freshmen in college. These are advancements that have happened in a matter of a couple months. So it really makes you start to question, what does 4 years from now look like? Now, I don't bring up these videos as a means of fear-mongering or creating some sort of a doomsday scenario. And this is certainly not a pro or anti-AI lecture. But what it is a signal of information. It is a warning sign, if you will, to start to prepare yourselves for what's to come. And when I started to think about people saying, oh, the world seems very uncertain right now, I think what's happening at a deeper level is we're worried about our identity as people. Most recently, my parents retired, and I know that the first year for them was difficult. And psychological research shows that that first year after retirement is very hard for people, because if you've had a certain profession for the last 25, 30, maybe 40 years, your identity has completely changed. You start asking yourself, who am I? What's my purpose? But today, there's a possibility that that identity is going to change on a yearly basis. So for many of us here in this classroom, you may have a vision for what your current major is, and it may be the case that what you're envisioning today may not be what the reality is for that occupation 4 years from now. So we have to think about, well, how do we handle that possibility? What can we do today to prepare ourselves? And when I've been thinking about the purpose of education and what I believe should be the purpose of your current education now as college students, is thinking about what are the things that you could be doing today that will help you tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, and the years to come. And I'm increasingly becoming convinced that it's our character that's going to play the biggest role as we move forward. And by character, I mean, what are the behaviors, what's our disposition when approaching knowledge? When we're trying to understand ourselves and understand the world around us, what are the habits that we are fostering in order to help us navigate unknown territory? And history and stories will tell you that there are winners and there are losers when it comes to those that pay attention to the signs that are calling for your attention, and those that ignore it. Now, I bring up Kodak as an example of an organization that saw disruption coming their way, but chose to ignore it. So for those of you who don't know what Kodak is, Kodak was the dominant player in film and camera for over 100 years. They literally had a monopoly on the entire film and camera industry. And then in the 1970s, one of their engineers actually invented the digital camera. Him, alongside a vice president, I believe his name was Don Strickland, approached the executives of Kodak and said, we have this digital camera. Digital is the future. We have a prototype that we would like to present and that we would like to implement into Kodak. And Kodak executives at that time were famous for saying, cute, But no, we're not going to do that. And the reason they didn't want to do it is because they feared that if word got out about digital cameras, other companies would come into play to try to develop their own cameras, outcompete them, and put them out of business. So they decided they weren't going to touch the digital camera. Well, this illogical thinking ultimately led to their bankruptcy because other competitors did show up. They invented the digital cameras, and they ultimately took over the market share. The biggest company at that time that did this was Apple. And so by 2012, Kodak became bankrupt and went completely out of business. So I bring up Kodak as a way of showing what happens when you see something coming and you decide to ignore it. So, but what was it about Kodak that made them fail? Was it really just a matter of them ignoring these inventors about the digital camera? What I believe happened with Kodak is they failed to implement a framework of what is known as intellectual virtues, which is what I'm here to talk to you about and what I believe could set all of us up for success in the future. Intellectual virtues, it sounds like a very academic-y, philosophical term, but it's something you all actually know. You just don't know that you know it. So intellectual virtues have to do with the facilitation of character and behavior that allows for excellent thinking. So when you think about Kodak, something that I came across when I was watching a Kodak documentary is that when the inventors came up to them with their idea, the questions that they asked were very baseline. They just asked these inventors, well, what does this look like for our margins? When are we going to make profit? Who's going to want a digital camera? While these are standard business questions, they're not deep questions that get to the truth of the matter of things. Whereas Apple had a very different approach to it. The questions they asked was, how can we make this an excellent experience for people? What is it that how can we use the digital camera to satisfy other people's wants and needs? So with intellectual virtues, there are many. In contemporary terms, you have terms like intellectual humility, intellectual courage, intellectual honesty. Now, some of those terms may sound familiar. I believe we've all heard the words humility, courage, honesty. But there is a difference between what's considered an intellectual virtue and what's known as a moral virtue. So just to show you a difference between the two, on your left, Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King was known for having courage. Now, Martin Luther King's motivation for what he did was to fight for justice. Whereas on the other side, we have George Orwell's 1984. How many of you remember 1984, the book? Probably read it in high school. So there was a character in the book named Winston Smith, and when he's being interrogated by the party, which was the totalitarian group that was trying to propagandize, I believe it was Oceania, they were forcing their people to believe that 2 + 2 was equal to 5. And when they brought Winston Smith in, they continued to interrogate him and basically demand of him that he agree that 2 + 2 is equal to 5. Now, for a long time in that scene, he doesn't budge. And that shows an intellectual courage, where the motivation isn't for justice in Martin Luther King's case, but it's rather a motivation for acquiring truth, for understanding and knowledge above all else. Unfortunately, Winston Smith does not last long in that regard, and he ends up saying that 2 + 2 is equal to 5, but nonetheless, that would be the difference between moral and intellectual virtues. So when you're thinking about your own pursuits. Let's say that you are working on something in regards to physical therapy. You're doing a study of some sort. Something you want to be thinking about are these 4 quadrants. Is the thing that you're looking at the right object, or is it the wrong object? So the golden mean is essentially trying to strike a balance between extremes of behavior, which are known as vices. So in the example with Kodak, when Kodak dismissed these executives, something that they were showing was essentially intellectual arrogance. They felt that they had 90% of the market and that there was no way anyone was going to touch them. And regardless of the fact that digital cameras were on the horizon, it wasn't something that Kodak needed to worry about because they were always going to be safe. That is an example of a company or executives on a personal level, and they're clearly trying to communicate something to human beings. So the military brings in Amy Adams. Her character's name is Dr. Louise Banks, and the reason they bring her in is because she is an expert in linguistics. She's the #1 scholar in this regard in the country. So they bring her in and they ask her to figure out what it is that these aliens are saying. Now, despite the fact that Amy Adams is a world expert in this regard, she approaches this opportunity with intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is being able to recognize the things that you know and the things that you don't know, any misconceptions or misbeliefs that you have, and have a willingness to correct for that. So Amy Adams, you see throughout the movie, is doing everything she can to figure out what they're saying, while also having an appropriate sense of doubt in her expertise. Whereas you see a few other characters that exemplify more vices. On one end, you have a group of researchers that have already been at the base, they're junior level, they have intellectual timidity. That means that they are overestimating the things that they don't know. Meaning they have knowledge, they could have a little bit more courage per se to talk to the military about what they're discovering, but they're too shy to do so. They end up underestimating themselves, ultimately. Whereas on the other extreme, you have the military that's a bit more dogmatic. The military, at one point in this movie, are talking to Amy Adams' character, and Amy Adams says, I figured out what the aliens have said. They keep saying the word tool. Immediately, the military assumes that tool means weapon and that weapon means threat, which is not what they meant. You ultimately learn that the aliens are trying to say gift, like they have a tool that's meant to be a gift. Or there are some of us that may feel we already know all there is to know about artificial intelligence, and that can make us also dismissive, putting truth as the overarching motivation above all else. So, intellectual courage, here's an example that you may be experiencing on college campuses. Right now, 79% of students are reluctant to engage in a contentious political conversation for at least one topic. As it stands right now, the Israel-Palestine conflict is the #1 contentious topic on college campuses. So in a classroom, you have a decision to make when that conversation comes up. You can either act in a more cowardly way, which means you have an opinion that you believe is true, or at least that you want to explore to see if it's true, but you self-censor yourself and you decide, I'm not willing to risk my friendships or the way people perceive me. So I'm going to not speak up. On the other end, you could act with what's called intellectual rashness, which means You feel so strongly and confident about what your viewpoint is that if someone else engages in the topic that you would in a way that you disagree with, you lash out on them. You call them insulting names, you yell at them, and you make it nearly impossible to have a conversation, despite the fact that you're engaging. Intellectual courage is that willingness to put yourself and your ideas out there, regardless of what those consequences might be, as long as it's in line with trying to acquire truth and a better understanding of the world. And we've seen these sorts of things play out in real life. This picture up here comes from a Solomon Asch experiment from the 1950s. So Solomon Asch was really interested in knowing how individuals respond to group pressure. So in this experiment, he had one person in a room that was, quote unquote, part of the experiment, where the rest of the people were in on the study. Essentially, they were actors. And so the task at hand was they were given that line that doesn't have any numbers on it on the left, and they asked the person, which line does that one match with? And so they would ask that person last. So this was the first slide that I had up. And this is actually a picture from the story of Noah, Noah's Ark. Now, the reason I called this Preparing for the Flood is because most recently I was listening to a lecture on the story of Noah, and I thought that it was very relevant to what we're all going through today and what I think each of you are going to go through over the next 4 years. So despite the fact that there's a lot of change happening in the world, especially around AI, and it's making maybe your major feel uncertain or what your profession's going to look like, I actually think that this is an opportunity to have a pretty exciting adventure. Now, mythical writer, scholar Joseph Campbell called this the hero's journey. So the hero's journey is a situation where you have an individual, they reside in a familiar world, they leave that world, and they're met with chaos, uncertainty, tumultuous times, but at the end of that journey, they experience a renewal of sorts. They grow from it, and not only does it help them as an individual, it also helps the community around them. And I actually think all of you are in that very position today. So in the story with Noah, what happens is, to make a long story short, God has at this point had enough of human beings. He's given them enough chances, and he decides that we need to do one big start over. And so he's going to introduce this deathly flood to the world. He decides to tell Noah that this is happening and says, if you prepare now, your life will be spared, your family's life will be spared, and the rest. And so what you learn in the story is that many people in Noah's community are in denial about this. They're saying, yeah, we are hearing about this flood. Yeah, it may happen. It may not happen. If it does happen, it may not be that intense. But nonetheless, Noah has received some sort of a warning or a signal and decides to take it seriously, to face the truth of the matter of things and adjust accordingly. So with that being said, I encourage you all to really embrace this time. Don't be afraid of it. And despite the fact that these tools are slowly taking over thinking, reasoning capacities, hopefully you all continue to think and problem solve, because these storms, whether it's AI or other storms of the future, they are going to continue to come. And all you can do now is put yourself in the best position possible to prepare for it and navigate it. All right? Thank you all.